Chapter 16 of Inspector French and the Cheyne Mystery by Freeman Wills Crofts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. A Tale of Two Cities. Next morning, French had an interview with his chief at the yard, at which he produced the torn hotel bill, and having demonstrated the methods by which he had come to identify it with the Grand Hôtel du Sablon in Bruges, suggested that a visit there might be desirable. To his secret relief, Chief Inspector Mitchell took the same view, and it was arranged that he should cross as soon as he could get away. On his return to his room, he found Cheyne waiting for him. The young man seemed to have aged by years since his frenzied appeal to the yard, and his anxious face and distrait manner bore testimony to the mental stress through which he was passing. Eagerly, he inquired for news.
"None so far, I'm sorry to say," French answered, "except that we have found that Miss Merrill did return to her rooms that night."
And he told what he had learned of Joan's movements, as well as of his visit to Hackworth's garage and of Blessington's exchange of cars. But of Bruges and the hotel bill he said nothing. Cheyne, he felt sure, would have begged to be allowed to accompany him to Belgium, and this he did not want. But in his kindly way, he talked sympathetically to the young man, reiterating his promise to let him know directly anything of importance was learned. Cheyne having reluctantly taken his leave, French turned to routine business, which had got sadly behind during the last few days. At this he worked all the morning, but on his return from lunch he found that further news had come in. Sergeant Burnett, the man he had put on the Waterloo Station job, was waiting for him and reported success in his mission. He had, he said, spent the whole of the day from early morning at the station, and at last he had obtained what he wanted. A taximan on a nearby stand had been called to the footpath at the arrival side of the station at about 2 p.m. He had drawn up behind an old black car, which he had thought was a Napier. His own fare, a lady, kept him waiting for a few seconds while she took a somewhat leisurely farewell of the gentleman who was seeing her off. And during this time he had idly watched the vehicle in front. He had seen an invalid lady in a sable-colored fur coat being helped in. There was a second lady with her, and a tall man. The three got in, and the car moved off at the same time as his own. Sergeant Burnett had questioned the man on the appearance of the travelers, and was pretty certain that they were Joan, Susan, and Syme. Dangle, so far as he could learn, was not with them. French felt the sudden thrill of the artist who had just caught the elusive effect of light which he wanted, as he reflected how sound had been his deduction. He had considered it likely that these people would use Waterloo Station to effect the change of cars, and now it seemed that they had done so. Nothing like a bit of imagination, he thought, as he good-naturedly complimented the sergeant on his powers, and dismissed him. Having too much to see at the yard to catch the 2 p.m. from Victoria to Ostend, he rang up and engaged a berth on the Harwich-Zeebrugge boat, and that night at 8:40 p.m. he left Liverpool Street for Belgium. Apart from his actual business, he was looking forward with considerable keenness to the trip. Foreign travel had become perhaps his greatest pleasure, and he had never yet been in Belgium. Moreover, he had always heard Bruges mentioned as the paradise of artists, and in a rather shamefaced way, he admitted an interest in and appreciation of art. He had determined that if at all possible, he would snatch enough time to see at least the more interesting parts of the old town. They left the Parkston Quay at 10:30, and by 6 next morning, French was on deck. He was anxious to miss no possible sight of the approach of Zeebrugge. He had read with a thrilled and breathless interest the story of what was perhaps the greatest naval exploit of all time, as indeed, who has not? And as the long, low line of the famous mole loomed up rather starboard of straight ahead, his heart beat faster and a lump came in his throat. There, away to the right, round the curve of the long pier, must have been where Vindictive boarded, where in an inferno of fire her crew reached with their scaling ladders the top of the great sea-wall, and climbing down on the inside, joined a hand-to-hand fight with the German defenders. and here, at the left-hand end of the huge semicircle, was the lighthouse, which he was now rounding as Thetis, Intrepid, and Iphigenia rounded it on that historic night. He tried to picture the scene, the screen of smoke to sea, which baffled the searchlights of the defenders, and from which mysterious and unexpected craft emerged at intervals, the flashing lights as guns were fired and shells burst over the mole, the sea, and the low-lying sand dunes of the coast behind. The din of hell in the air, fire, smoke, explosion, and death, and those three ships passing on. Thetis, a wreck, struck and fiercely burning, forced aside by the destruction of her gear, but lighting her fellows straight to their goal, the mouth of the canal which led to the submarine base at Bruges. French crossed the deck and gazed at the spot with its swing bridge and stone-side walls. As he thought how, had the desperate venture failed, history might have been changed, and at that touch-and-go period of the war, the Central Powers might have triumphed. It was with renewed pride and wonder in the men who conceived and carried out the wonderful enterprise that he crossed back over the deck and set himself to the business of landing. A short run past the sandhills at the coast and across the flat Belgian fields brought the spires of Bruges into view, and slowly rounding a sharp curve through the gardens of the houses in the suburbs, they joined the main line from Ostend, and a few minutes later entered the station. Emerging onto the wide boulevard in front, French's eyes fell on a bus bearing the legend, Grand Hôtel du Sablon, and getting in, he was driven across the boulevard and a short way up a long, rather narrow and winding street, between houses, some of which seemed to have stood unaltered, and doubtless had, for 600 years, when Bruges, 3 times its present size, was the chief trading city of the Hanseatic League. As he turned into the hotel, chimes rang out. From the famous belfry, the porter told him. Tinkling, high-pitched bells and silvery, if a trifle thin in the clear morning air. He called for some breakfast, and as he was consuming it, the anticipated delights of sightseeing receded, and interest in the movements of James Dangle became once more paramount. He was proud of his solution of the problem of the torn hotel bill, and not for a moment had a doubt of the correctness of that solution entered his head. It came upon him, therefore, as a devastating shock when the courteous manager of the hotel, with whom he had asked an interview, assured him not only that no such person as the original of the photograph he had presented had ever visited his establishment, but that the fragment of the bill was not his. To French, it seemed as if the bottom had fallen out of his world. He had been so sure of his ground. All his reasoning about the stamp, the size of the hotel in town, and lengths of their names had seemed so convincing and unassailable. And the names Grand Hôtel du Sablon and Bruges had worked in so well. More important still, no other hotel seemed to fill the bill. French felt cast down to the lowest depths of despair, and for a time he could only stare speechlessly at the manager. At last he smiled rather ruefully.
"That's rather a blow," he confessed. "I was pretty sure of my ground. Indeed, so sure was I that if I might without offence, I should like to ask you again if there is no possibility that the man might have been here, say, during your absence."
The manager was sympathetic. He brought French a sample of his bill, stamped with his rubber receipt stamp, and French saw at once their dissimilarity with those he had been studying. Moreover, the manager assured him that neither had been altered for several years. So he was no further on. French lit a cigar, and retiring to a deserted corner of the salon, sat down to think the thing out. What was he to do next? Was he to return to London by the next boat, giving up the search and admitting defeat? Or was there any possible alternative? He set his teeth as he swore great oaths that nothing short of the direct need would lead him to abandon his efforts until he found the hotel and learned Dangle's secret. But heroics were all very well. What, in point of fact, was he to do? He sat considering the problem for an hour, and at the end of that time he had decided to go to Brussels, borrow or buy a Belgian hotel guide, and go through it page by page until he found what he wanted. If none of the hotels given suited, he would go on to Paris and try a similar experiment. This decision he reached only after long consideration, not because it was not obvious, it had instantly occurred to him, but because he was convinced that the methods he had already tried had completely covered the ground. He had proved that there was no hotel whose name ended in "lon" in a fair-sized town whose name ended in "s" in all the district in question, other than the Grand Hôtel du Sablon at Bruges. There still remained, however, the chance that it might be a southern French or Swiss hotel, and he saw that he would have to make sure of this before returning to London. Still buried in thought, he walked slowly back to the station to look up trains to Brussels. The fact that he was in the most interesting town in Belgium no longer stirred his pulse. His disappointment and anxiety about his case drove all irrelevant matters from his mind, and he felt that all he wanted now was to be at work again, to retrieve his error. He reached the station and began searching the huge timetable boards for the train he wanted. He was interested to notice that the tables were published in 2 languages, French and what he thought at first was Dutch, but concluded later must be Flemish. Idly, he compared the different spelling of the names of the towns: Brugge and Bruges, Ghent and Gand, Brussels and Bruxelles, Ostend and Ostend. And then suddenly he came up as it were all standing, and a sudden wave of excitement passed over him as he stood regarding another pair of names, Antwerpen and Anvers. Anvers, a 6-lettered town ending in S. He cursed himself for his stupidity. He had always thought of the place as Antwerp, but he ought to have known its French name, Anvers. Once more he was alert and full of eager optimism. Had he got it at last? He passed through onto the platform, and making for a door headed chef de gare, asked for the station master. There, after a moment's delay, he was shown into the presence of an imposing individual in gold lace, who, however, was not too important to listen to him carefully, and reply courteously in somewhat halting English. Monsieur wished to know if there was an hotel whose name ended in "lon" in Antwerp. He could not recall one offhand, but he would look up the advertisements in his guides and tourist programs. Ah, what was this? The Grand Hôtel du Carillon? Was that what Monsieur required? A name of 20 letters, which would exactly fill the space on the receipt stamp. It certainly was what Monsieur required. The very idea raised Monsieur to an exalted pitch of delighted enthusiasm. The station master was gratified at the reception of his information. "I have been at the hotel myself," he volunteered. "It is small, but very good. It is in the Place Verte, near to the cathedral. Does Monsieur know Antwerp?" Monsieur did not, but he expressed the pleasure it would give him to make its acquaintance, and thanking the polite official, he returned to the timetables to look up the trains thither. His most direct way, it appeared, was through Ghent and Termonde, but on working out the services he found he could get quicker trains via Brussels. He therefore booked by that route, and at 11:51 he climbed into a great through express from Ostend to Brussels, Aix-la-Chapelle, Strasbourg, and it seemed to him the whole of the rest of Europe. An hour and a half's run brought him into Brussels Nord, and from there he wandered out into the Place Roger for lunch. Then, returning to the station, he took an express for Antwerp, arriving in the central terminus of that city a few minutes after 3 o'clock. He had bought a map of Antwerp at a bookstall in Brussels, from which he had learned that the Place Verte was nearly a mile away in the direction of the river. His travelling impedimenta consisting of a handbag only, he determined to walk, and emerging from the great marble hall of the station, he passed down the busy Avenue de Kaiser and along the Place de Mer into the older part of the town. As he walked, he was immensely impressed by the fine wide streets, the ornate buildings, and the excellence of the shops. Everywhere were evidence of wealth and prosperity. And as he turned into the Place Verte and looked across at the huge bulk of the cathedral with its soaring spire, He felt that here was an artistic treasure of which any city might well be proud. The Grand Hotel de Carillon was an old, quaint-looking building, looking out over the Place Verte. French, entering, called for a bock in the restaurant, and after he had finished, asked to see the manager. A moment later, a small, stout man with a humorous eye appeared, bowed low, and said that he was Monsieur Marquet, the proprietor.
"A word with you in private, Monsieur Marquet,"
French requested when they had exchanged confidences on the weather.
"Won't you take something with me?"
The proprietor signified his willingness in excellent English, and when further drinks had been brought, and French had satisfied himself that they were alone, he went on.
"I am a detective officer from the London police, and I am trying to trace an Englishman called Dangle. I have reason to suppose he stayed at this hotel recently. There is his photograph. Can you help me at all?"
At the name Dangle, Monsieur Marquet had nodded, and when he saw the photograph he beamed and his whole body became affirmation personified. But certainly he knew Monsieur Dangle. For several weeks, he could not say how many, but he could ascertain from his records. For several weeks Monsieur Dangle had been his guest at intervals. Sometimes he had stayed one night, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Yes, he was usually alone, but not always. On 3 or 4 occasions he had been accompanied by another gentleman, a tall, well-built, clean-shaven man, and once a third man had come, a short man with a fair moustache. Yes, that was the photograph of the short man, Blessington. The other man's name he could not remember, but it would appear in the register. Sight, something like that. Yes, Syme, that was it. No, he was afraid he knew nothing about these gentlemen or their business, but he would be glad to do everything in his power to assist Monsieur. French, his enthusiasm and delight remaining at fever heat, was suitably grateful. He wished just to ask Monsieur Marquet a few more questions. He would like to know the last occasion on which Monsieur Dangle had stayed. "Why?" Monsieur Marquet exclaimed.
"He just left yesterday. He came here, let me see, on Tuesday night quite late. Indeed, it was nearly 1 on Wednesday morning when he arrived. He came, he said, off the English boat train which arrives here about midnight. He stayed here 2 days, till yesterday, Thursday. He left yesterday, shortly after déjeuner." "He was alone?"
"Yes, monsieur. This time he was alone." French, metaphorically speaking, hugged himself on hearing this news. Through his brilliant work with the torn bill, he had added one more fine achievement to the long list of his successes. He could not but believe that the most doubtful and difficult step of the investigation had now been accomplished. With the trail only 24 hours old, he should surely be able to put his hands on Dangle with but little delay. Moreover, from the fact that so many visits had been paid to Antwerp, it looked as if the secret of the gang was hidden in the city. Greatly reassured, he proceeded to acquire details. He began by obtaining, from Monsieur Marquet's records, lists of the visits of the 3 men, and that gentleman's identification of the torn bill. Also, he pressed him as to whether he could not remember any questions or conversations of the trio which might give him a hint as to their business, but without success. He saw and made a detailed search of the room Dangle had occupied during his last visit, but here again with no result. Dangle, Monsieur Marquet said, had been out all day on the Wednesday, the day after his arrival, but on Thursday he had remained in the hotel until his departure about 2 p.m. Monsieur Marquet had not seen him leave, but he had sent the waiter for his bill after déjeuner, and the proprietor believed he had gone a little later. Possibly the porter could give more information on the point. The porter was sent for and questioned. He knew Monsieur Dangle well and recognized his photograph. He had been present in the hall when the gentleman left on the previous day, shortly before 2 o'clock. Monsieur Dangle had walked out of the hotel with his suitcase in his hand, declining the porter's offer to carry it for him or call a taxi. The trams, however, passed the door, and the porter had assumed Mr. Dangle intended to travel by that means. No, he had not noticed the direction he took. There was a still stand or tramway halt close by. Dangle had not talked to the porter further than to wish him good day when he met him. He had not asked questions or given any hint of his business in the town. Following his usual procedure under such circumstances, French next asked for interviews with all those of the staff who had come in any way in contact with his quarry. But in spite of his most persistent efforts, he could not extract a single item of information as to the man's business or movements. Baffled and weary from his journey, French took his hat and went out in the hope that a walk through the streets of the fine old city would clear his brain and bring him the inspiration he needed. Crossing beneath the trees of the Place Verte, he passed round the cathedral to the small square from which he could look up at the huge bulk of the west front, with its two unequal towers, one a climbing marvel of decoration, lace in stone, the other unfinished, and topped with a small and evidently temporary spire. Then, promising himself a look round the interior before leaving the town, he regained the tram line from the Place Verte, and following it westwards, in 2 or 3 minutes came out on the great terraces lining the banks of the river. The first sight of the Scheldt was one which French felt he would not soon forget. Well on to half a mile wide, it bore away in both directions, like a great highway leading from this little Belgium to the uttermost parts of the earth. Large ships lay at anchor in it, as well as clustering along the wharves to the south. This river frontage of wharves and sheds and cranes and great steamers extended as far as the eye could reach. He had read that it was 3.5 miles long, and that excluded the huge docks for which the town was famous. As he strolled along, he became profoundly impressed, not only with the size of the place, but more particularly with the attention which had been given to its artistic side. In spite of all this commercial activity, the city did not look sordid. Thought had been given to its design. One might almost say loving care. Why, these very terraces on which he was walking, with their cafes and their splendid view of the river, were formed on neither more nor less than the vast roofs of the dock sheds. French, who knew most of the English ports, felt his amazement grow at every step. He followed the quays right across the town till he came to the Gare du Sud. Then, turning away from the river, he found himself in the Avenue du Sud. From this, he worked back along the line of great avenues which had replaced the earlier fortifications, until eventually, nearly 3 hours after he had started, he once again turned into the Place Verte and reached the Carillon. He ordered a room for the night and some strong tea, after which he sat on in his secluded corner of the comfortable restaurant and smoked a meditative cigar. His walk had done him good. His brain had cleared, and the weariness of the journey and the chagrin of his deadlock had vanished. His thoughts returned to his problem, which he began to attack in the new. He puzzled over it for the best part of an hour, without making the slightest progress, and then he began to consider how far the ideas he had already arrived at fitted in with what he had since learned of Dangle's movements. He had thought that the nature of the articles on Dangle's list suggested a sea expedition. He remembered the delight with which, many years earlier, he had read The Riddle of the Sands, and he thought that had Dangle contemplated just such another cruise as that of the heroes of that fascinating book, he might well have got together the articles in question. But since these ideas had passed through his mind, French had learned the following fresh facts. 1. From a fortnight after obtaining the tracing, Dangle had been paying frequent visits to Antwerp. 2. He had on these occasions put up at the Carillon. 3. His last visit had followed immediately on the failure to murder Cheyne, with its almost certain result of the calling in of Scotland Yard. 4. He had on this last visit remained at the Carillon for 2 days, leaving about 2 p.m. on the Thursday, the previous day. 5. He had carried his handbag from the hotel without calling for a taxi. At first, French could not see that these additional facts had any bearing on his theory, but as he continued turning them over in his mind, he realized that all but one might be interpreted as tending in the same direction. 1. Dangle's visits to Antwerp. Supposing Dangle had been planning some secret marine expedition, where, French asked himself, could he have found a more suitable base from which to make his arrangements? Antwerp was a seaport. Moreover, it was a great seaport, large enough for a secret expedition to set sail from without attracting notice. It was a foreign port, away from the inquisitive notice of the British police. But on the other hand, it was the nearest great port to London. If these considerations did not back up his theory, they at least did not conflict with it. 2. Why had Dangle put up at the Carillon? The hotels near the station were the obvious ones for English visitors. Could it be because the Place Verte was close to the river and the shipping? This, French admitted to himself, sounded far-fetched, and yet it might be the truth. 3. The dispersal and disappearance of the gang immediately on the probability of its activities becoming known to the police looked suspiciously like a flight. 4. Could it be that Dangle's arrival in Antwerp was ahead of schedule? That is, the flight brought him there 2 days before the expedition was to start? Or could it be that on his arrival he immediately set to work to organize the departure, but was unable to complete his arrangements for 2 days? At least it might be so. Lastly, had he carried his bag from the hotel for the same reason as he might have chosen the hotel? That he was going, not to the station, but the few hundred yards to the quays, thence to start on this maritime expedition? Again, it might be so. French was fully aware that the whole of these elaborate considerations had the actual stability of a house of cards. Each and every one of his deductions might be erroneous, and the facts might be capable of an entirely different construction. Still, there was at least a suggestion that Dangle might have left Antwerp by water shortly after 2 o'clock on the previous day. It was the one constructive idea French could evolve, and he decided that in the absence of anything better, he would try to follow it up. It was too late to do anything that night. After dinner, therefore, he had another walk, spent an hour in a cinema, and then went early to bed, so as to be fresh for his labors of the following day. End of chapter 16.